Today, I'm going to be ranking all the bosses that you fight in Metaphor ReFantazio, and I do have to add some clarification to that. This is all the mainline bosses you encounter in the game. For the most part, there are a few side bosses. Technically, the trials are pretty much the majority of those ones. I won't go into more details about them until that section because, you know, spoilers. So keep in mind, this entire video is a huge spoiler for Metaphor ReFantazio, but don't worry, I'm going to be going in order of appearance of these bosses, so you can just watch up until the point where you see the last boss that you've personally encountered so far, and then stop the video there. This also is only going to be the mainline actual bosses. Majority, there are some other things that are considered main bosses in the game. For example, the human you come across in the Nord mines is considered a boss, even though that exact same human would appear later on in the game as some form of typical enemy. So any of the bosses that reappear later as typical enemies, I'm just not counting whatsoever. I'm also not accounting the reappearance of some of these bosses because that's also just, I don't really care too much about that. We're only here to talk about the mainline boss fights that you encounter into this game. So let's get into it. Starting off with the first one you encounter, Homo Goo. What a way to introduce the concept of a human to this game. Honestly, the freakish design of this one is like, it's not too crazy to say the least. Homo Goo is a very intriguing design, and I'm honestly quite a fan of how it goes. It also introduces you to the multi-layers of the human boss fight, where you've got its wings, which you want to take out to stop its wind-based attack. You can take out its legs to get rid of its swiping attack and make it either just miss entirely or do significantly less damage, as well as the apples that it has floating around it. You also are encouraged to get rid of them because it can eat them to heal some of its health. You also get the first introduction to Gallica in getting involved in certain boss fights, where she can just come in, whack off all the apples on Homo Goo, and then he can't heal himself for a bit until it inevitably regenerates its apples again. Ultimately, a really fun boss fight and a really great way to introduce the human monster concept to the game, and I'm gonna go and grab Homo Goo and put him in A tier. Next in technical bosses, we have Captain Klinger. I mean, there's really not much to think about when it comes to this boss outside of Stroll's Awakening, but I'm not going to consider any of the awakenings for these boss fights itself because we're mainly talking about the boss fights. All in all, Captain Klinger is just kind of forgettable for the most part and is just a unit that, yeah, he appears later on in the story very briefly before X, Y, and Z. We will talk about that in a moment, but ultimately, very forgettable. I'm going to put him in the D tier. The next fight we come across is Undead Grius. So after the I hit the desk a little bit there. After the emotional gut punch of losing Grius in the royal funeral, if you hadn't already, I don't know, guessed the fact that he was probably going to die there purely because, you know, he did not have an awakening like Stroll and the main character had so far. You just gave him an archetype, so that was a very big flag there. And just the entire plan just seems like it'd be too easy, too simple, and of course something would get in the way of doing it. And what do you know? That's exactly what happens. But then the game decides to give us one guttural punch further, that not only after you've killed him off on us, he then reappears as his undead variation, which just that alone I love. I absolutely love. I hate it, but I love it at the same time because it's just such a fun like you won't forget that that fight in this game purely because of just how it's done. It's like, hey, this character that you kind of liked for the brief amount of time he was with your party, yeah, he's back now in his undead format and he's now going to fight you. So we're going to grab Undead Grius and we're going to throw him into the S tier because I just think it was a really fun way of just doing that, bringing him back in very briefly as an undead character to not only after you've already dealt with the emotional gut punch of losing him, he's now back as an undead. The fight itself is It's like all the non-human boss fights don't tend to be too interesting for the most part. It's just kind of it's got some attacks, it's got the Phantom Dance, which can do some really wacky things, but ultimately, Undead Grius is just cool because of what it is, what it represents. Next, we have Zorba. Again, I feel like this fight is somewhat forgettable, especially when it gets immediately outclassed by Homo Avus afterwards, and Zorba is a character, I love him. Like, he is just a really cool and fun character, and I just love what the game does with him. Oh wait, that's slightly a spoiler, but kind of also makes sense. Zorba is just interesting. And also, how much he rides Louis is kind of fun. The fact that in the dungeon, approaching him for the first time, you can just use the portrait of Louis to make him not shatter you to bits with bone bullets, which is kind of funny. But ultimately, the boss fight itself, neither here nor there, just going to throw Zorba's boss fight into B. And then next we have the follow-up to Zorba, Homo Avus, which, man, such a fun design, especially considering it is based upon an old artwork. I don't remember most of the details off the top of my head. I just know that it is basically very, very, very similar to an artwork from way, way back in the day. And honestly, the design is just really creepy. The fact that it's an egg that you keep cracking, and when you crack the egg, he falls down, you can attack his heart, which is on top of his head. Just some really funky designs. And just the idea that after he comes back up, instead of just immediately healing the egg, he now spawns a bunch of little things that will just dash out at you and do a lot of damage if you can't get rid of them, which is when Gallica reappears for the first time in a while to disrupt them, does a chunk of damage, so it's easier for you to kill them. I don't feel like that is too massive. In reality, you just guard, you don't take too much damage, and you move on. Also, its two giant creepy hands that it uses to heal its egg is just some level of funk that I don't really know how to describe. But as with the human boss fights so far, I just love them in spite of how creepy they are. So we're putting Homo Avus in, I would say, the A tier for now. The next thing you come across is the great worm Homo Butera, which you come across when you're running down the quest line in Martria, when you're chasing down Heismay. You encounter it in the middle of the desert when the worms are supposedly be asleep, per the information that you gained from, I forget his name off the top of my head. Whoops. Ultimately, I love it. You don't technically win. Instead, after getting close to beating the worm, which is a funky, like, the design is horrifying to say the least, it then eats you. And then you get the fun sequence of escaping through its digestive system and going out its ass before it fully digests you, which I just love it. As much as, like, it's just weird to say I love I love being digested and coming out the back end, it's just fun and quirky. Like, I just love like, I don't really have a best way to describe why I like it. It's just a funky idea of, like, yeah, you've just been eaten by the worm, now get out before it kills you. So ultimately, I will put him up into, I would say, B tier. Not my favorite human out of the lot so far. Like, there's nothing that really pops up in my mind as major things that the boss does in its fight as well. Like, part of this, like, I do watch over some of the fights again to remind myself of certain things if I can't remember them off the top of my head. But this is also part way, like, how much of the fight itself is ingrained in my memory after playing it over the past month. The next technical boss fight is versing Heismay in the wormhole thingamy-bob inside of that big worm cave he's hanging out in. And this is embarrassing. The predominant thing I remember is the fact that the tell for his main ability is very, very obvious once you know it, because I just didn't realize it the entire flippin' time until Gallica said, oh yeah, by the way, look at its shadow. The one with the shadow is the real Heismay. And I was just so annoyed at myself, upset at myself. I don't know the right words. The fact that I just didn't see that tell. I just got lucky and knocked the right one a handful of times and thought, like, maybe I figured it out. I still can't figure out the actual tell and I'm lost again. But no, it was just something so simple. And I kind of like that, where it's like, it's something that is very obvious, but you can very easily miss if you're not paying attention for that very obvious thing. Like, it's just not something that came up in my mind. Other people probably had a far easier time dealing with it because they did pick up on the shadow being the core thing here. All the way, Heismay is a fun character. His little fight was fun. I'm going to slam him up into the A tier. Homo Jaluzo. This baby can go f*** itself. Like, its design, its sounds, everything about it is so... It curls me a little. It just is so gross, creepy. I don't know the right words for it. Everything about it, like... I think it's the best design of a human in the entire game. Bar none. Purely because of just... If you don't know what you're expecting, even after the little build up towards it, when you get the little bit of information about what happened here, about what happened with the Sanctoris, what Joanna went through, and things on those lines, you might have put 2 and 2 together, but not quite. And then you hear the noises, and then you see the design, and then it eats the fucking guard by splitting its entire jaw off, and it gets like everything about it is insane with its design. It is. I hate it because it's so gross, but I think it's the best designed human in the entire game, purely because of just like the fact, like it's just, you take a baby and you give it this wild, creepy, and just gross design. Its effects, what it does in the fight, the fact that you can poke out its eyes and they go blood red, which is just another level of just, Spoiler for the later game, just briefly, just double tap on your screen to skip the next 10 seconds or something along those lines. This reappearance in the later game, I just kind of said, no, go away, don't like you, shoo, you just suck. It's just the design of this boss is just honestly amazing, but I absolutely hate it at the same time. And for that, I've just got to throw it right up in the S tier. Sorry, Undead Grius, you've been knocked down by the baby. The undead baby of all things. Next one is Glodell, which you encounter at the end of the Charadrius sneak-in shenanigans. Some people consider the units that you have to actually fight throughout the Charadrius itself as bosses. I don't completely agree. I would just say they're mini bosses, but they're not a boss. Glodell is the boss of the sequence, which, to be honest, he's forgettable. Like, outside of Junior's Awakening, I don't really remember too much about that fight off the top of my head. He has his dog, which so happens to be a fiend, or monster, or whatever you want to call it, which is interesting to say the least. I mean, the story implications of it, the fact that you challenge him to a duel, he doesn't realize that makes him vulnerable to being hit, because the King's magic will now no longer protect him. And then after he has the duel, he tries to swipe out the main character. Instead, he gets caught by the King's magic and is killed by it. It's one of those things where I just think overall Glodell as a character was annoying in the early game. You eventually get to beat his ass, and then that's about it. And his fight is just forgettable, to be honest. Entity with the captain. Next, we have the sea horror Homo Sabara. What an interesting one. I just love the idea that this is probably the first major moment in the story where you figure out that Forden is just a lying bastard. He said that he claimed to have taken the big sea monster that was infesting the waters, and then you encounter it yourself. And then you just realize, oh, he was fucking lying. He wasn't even trying to be honest. He didn't even actually do what he said he was going to do. It's like some moment where you go, like, you don't like the character, but maybe he's somewhat reasonable and actually cares about the people to some degree to, oh, he's just an ass. Of course, there's other things that slowly give you those telltale signs. But yeah, also, the fight was quite funky to say the least, because the game doesn't quite tell you right off the bat that, you know, he has arms you can chop off. And if you do that, then his massive attack, where he just randomly whacks you, does significantly less damage. It caught me off guard the first time, but once you understand that little thing, it wasn't really that bad. It is a very, like, the design of Homo Sabara is very interesting, and I love it. But also, I don't know, it doesn't creep me out as much as just Lucio does, because that design, I've had my little rant on that. That design's insane. Homo Sabara, it's a fun boss. It's nothing too special, if I'm honest. I'm just going to put it at C. Next, we have Marata Draco Ek, which is currently being written by a human. This fight was meh. If I'm honest, this one, I know what it does. You have Euphor's Awakening, which is really cool, but ultimately it's just beat the human till it dies and then get the dragon. Nothing too special happens with this fight for the most part. It's not bad, it's just not interesting, and honestly, I will put Mr. Dragon God here into C. Now, versing Homo Margo on his own when he's at the island, oh boy, what a fight. that was. Like, the idea that he just casually changes his affinity just at pure random sake when he just feels like it. Well, not pure random sake. He was doing it almost every turn for the most part, kind of. And just the fact that he would be immune to certain things or repel certain things. It was a very interesting boss fight that really made you think, especially considering that you kind of have to stick with all the same archetypes all your units already have off the back of the previous boss fight, which is a major thing. You do get given a chance to swap who you actually are in your team before you get into the fight, so the game gives you that at least. It also restores your MP and health, but you get stuck with what you already have equipped for everyone, and you just have to fight it with that. And it's very interesting for the first time you encounter it because of its continuously changing affinities, and for the most part, a good chunk of them is immune to most things, and you kind of have to play this guessing game to figure out what things you can actually damage it with and what just gets around it. Unless you have almighty damage galore, then it's really neither here nor there. This is also another boss fight where Gallica can get involved. She can forcibly keep Homo Margo to stay on the one affinity for a little bit longer. I never used it myself purely because she kind of asks you the moment after she's changed the affinity, and unless you remember the exact things that it's weak to off the top of your head based upon the color of the affinity itself, you don't have that information, and Gallica's already asking if you want to keep it that way. I wish she asked after you had a moment to actually check its new affinities and what you've seen with this one already and whether you want to keep it or not. Otherwise, Gallica's thing was kind of just non-consequential here. For those of you who do pay more attention to the color and then what it's immune to, Gallica's thing will probably provide a lot more functionality. I didn't, so it was useless to me in my opinion, but it was a really good fight nevertheless. Just the idea of it changing affinities pretty commonly and making most of the things that you would usually use as an attack either repel or just be completely immune to was definitely devastating. It took me a few attempts for this one, so I'm just going to put him up in the high A tier. Really good fight. Next we have Louis Guiabern. What a lad. Bro gets absolutely stabbed almost near the heart with Dracodios, and bro just gets up, goes upstairs, and just fights you then and there. Like, that is just the sheer audacity of that is insane to me. Like, just how he's like, I've just been stabbed, I've been severely weakened, I've got to find these people and fight them right now. Obviously, because he is weakened, it's not as painful as a fight as you might think it would be. It's not that bad. It's a very interesting fight, as well as some of his mechanics, especially with his little habitations that it seems his AI is more willing to go after the pro tag over all the other units, even if there is an easy weakness to go for. It just seems to favor going after the pro tag more often than not, and overall a very fun and interesting fight. Leave me to put Louis Guiabern in, I would still say the A tier. Next is Sogne the Icebound. This is the dragon that is summoned by Rella when you meet her at the Mage Academy, and this fight was probably the first one that I actually properly struggled on. It took me several attempts to get through this one, and it was ultimately thanks to Basilio's new addition and the Berserker with its ability to charge up and do mega damage with one-ton destruction, which also gives it weakness to strike till the next time you use strike on the character, which made it so it was a lot easier to go through. This is also one of the more longer boss fights, so you do have to somewhat reserve your MP to a heavy strength, because you will take out most of the dragon's health. Rella will just give all her magic to the dragon and then heal it back to full, and then you have to go through it all over again. This time though, the dragon's doing a lot more damage, doing a lot more shenanigans, just being overall more of a problem than it was before. Ultimately, very interesting, and I liked this idea, this technically being your first introduction to the dragons. Technically, unless you chose to fight the one in the Nord mines at the start of the game, but I also know that a lot of people tend to just not do it because, you know, the game encourages you to not do so. So most people tend to just follow that and go, okay, cool, I won't do it. You can definitely fight him, but you're also might be pretty low on MP at that point throughout the cave, depending on how you've played, depending on what you know, etc, etc. And yeah, what a really fun introduction to the dragons as a whole. So I'm just going to take Sogne the Icebound, and honestly, I will put him in the high A tier. I would say probably I like Louis's first fight a bit more than Sogne the Icebound. Now, from this point onwards, this will be massive spoilers to the end game of Metaphor ReFantazio. For those of you who are questioning, what about the second time you fight Louis? It doesn't really get counted as a boss fight for the most part. And I honestly have to agree with it. It's not too hard to deal massive amounts of damage to Louis and get his health low enough that it just kicks into the story from that point. It's like he's not really fighting per se. He's just letting you deal the damage until you get to a certain point, and then he does his thing. So most people don't seem to count as a boss fight. It's not really counted as a boss fight on most wikis, which is interesting to say the least, and I somewhat agree with it. But next we have Melancholised Zorba. Oh boy. If I said if the previous version of Zorba was somewhat forgettable, this one totally is not that one. I love the idea that Zorba is so obsessed with making sure Louis gets what he wants, gets the world he wants, even with the knowledge of what that actually means. He's accepted it to the point where he was willing to go through some form of transformation that humanized part of his body in order to become stronger. And then just the idea of how it entirely moves. It has two different variations, whether it's going to be consistently whacking at you or whether it goes into a full defense thing that pretty much makes most damage bounce off of it and hit you. Some damage does go through, but ultimately it becomes you just want to just guard, heal up, take the moment to actually heal a bit. And I love how this fight is somewhat telegraphed. You do understand what's happening after a few rounds. You understand after you do a significant amount of damage, he's most likely going to go into defense mode. He's going to remove your buffs. He's going to buff himself up with a maxed out 3-ray heat riser, and if you give him the chance to, he will heal himself. So you kind of do need to buff yourself temporarily in the midst of that, so you make sure he uses one of his turns to remove your buffs again so he doesn't heal himself, and then he ultimately flicks back to his attack mode and goes swinging at you again. And then you've just got to brunt that damage briefly, and then you get to remove his buffs, and then you get to swing out at him again, and then he'll go back to defense mode. It's kind of I like how it's telegraphed to a heavy point. You can understand the basis of what this fight's going to be based upon what it does the first few times. Gallica can get involved here to disrupt the shield in defense mode from Zorba, and he will then retaliate in his next turn by slashing out like a maniac and doing massive amounts of damage. And I did that I did that multiple times throughout my multiple different attempts on the Frost, and I just realized that ultimately you do it the first time because he won't do you're not going to be in a state where that damage is going to destroy you. And then you might do it a second time if you're feeling ballsy and think you can handle the output of damage that's about to occur. But then you don't do it again because it becomes way too risky the lower health he gets, because he seemingly does more damage. And I don't remember if he has Hero Cry or not, but it's just very interesting, and I just love the fight as a whole. And honestly, I would put Melancholised Zorba up into the S tier. Next, we got the Dragon Trials. These were some interesting things. First up, in the order that I did them in, is the Devourer of Nations. This is probably the easiest one of the lot overall. It is a normal dragon that does fire damage, and yeah, that's about it. It takes a bit of time. One of the more interesting quirks of the dragons as a whole is that at the start of every one of their turns, if they don't have a maxed out attack stat, they will give them 3 bars of attack to themselves and then deal damage. So unless you want it to burn a turn every single time and you burn a move every single time by removing its buffs, then yeah, I guess you could do something with that, but that's the most predictable thing it's going to do. And yeah, it's ultimately just a not too difficult of a dragon fight. It is not easy, but it's definitely enjoyable to the degree. And so I'll put him at B tier. Next, we have Devourer of Stars. I'm just going to go out and say it. I don't like this fight at all. So Devourer of Stars has 2 key things. It gives you Hex and it gives you Poison. That's about all that you can guarantee out of this fight. Oh, and then also at the start of the first move it does on its first turn is usually this board effect that just decreases your health down to 300 flat for every one of your characters. Granted, the damage the Devourer of Stars deals is not going to just immediately one-shot you because of that, unless you get certain things that I'll get to, but ultimately it does become an issue because this fight is not really telegraphed. Outside of he's always going to give himself the Great Dragon buff, which is 3 attack ups, pretty much every time he doesn't have the boosted attack. You can't predict how this fight's going to roll out. You can get really, really unlucky, and it does Poison Tail 3 times in a row and just wipes your team. Like, it's just how this one goes. I believe I spent a good 4 hours trying to do this fight until I eventually got through, because this fight is very heavily reliant on RNG unless you're so supremely over leveled for this fight that it just becomes a cakewalk for you to deal the necessary damage to break through. Of course, it does become a little easier if you do have accessories or clothes that make it so that your units are immune to poison or hex enchantments, but the likelihood of you having many of those at this point in time is neither here nor there. You'll definitely have it if you have to walk out on the first attempt and go again. You will now have been organized to deal with what it does. Probably the most problematic thing is that, like, even if you'll keep up with the elements that it gives you, it can give your character's hex and then immediately do its dark breath damage right afterwards, which, by the way, even though for the entirety of the game hex has kind of been one of those things, if you deal damage while you're hexed, you will take a brunt of that damage back. No, with the Devourer of Stars, if you're hexed, it's dragon breath, it's Death Breath or Dark Breath, whatever it's called, will do a shit ton of damage and effectively one-shot your unit unless you're resistant to dark damage. No joke. In the same turn, it can give you Hex and then immediately wipe the unit that now has Hex. RNG can give you a lot of bullshit with this one, and I'm going to be completely honest, it is very likely to piss you off if you get really unlucky with RNG. Overall, it's not a bad fight, it's just too RNG reliant and you can't really predict half the things. I'm just going to put it at C. Next one is Devourer of Flames. This is an interesting one. If you go to this dragon first, it is the most difficult dragon out of the lot. You go to it first, it will fucking wipe the board with you flat because it has an attack that it will deal 9,999 damage, fire damage to your entire party. So unless you can block fire damage or repel fire damage, you will die. Your unit will die to that attack. But this is where that little thing comes in. If you do it as the last dragon you do, the previous 2 dragons gave you fireproof armor, so now 2 of your party members are now fireproof. There is one really quirky way to deal with this boss. It is giving it weakness to fire via the Persona Master or the Masked Dancer or the Royal Dancer, depending on which you have at the time, and then give a unit repel the next elemental attack so that when it does its 9,999 damage, it will then reflect and hit the dragon itself, dealing the near 10,000 damage to itself. Again, it takes like 2 of these hits, I believe, plus your own set of damage to kill the dragon. So it's not too easy, but it's not too difficult. And ultimately, it's just a funny way that you can cheese this fight when you get to it. But it will definitely cause problems. But also, this dragon telegraphs its major attack. The turn beforehand, it will make an attempt to charm your entire party. When it does that, its next turn, it's going to do that mass fire damage attack. And so that's when you need to make your preparations. Either way, a really fun fight, and I do love how this fight rewards you for actually doing the other dragons first, because you get to get around its major thing because you now have the 2 armors from the previous dragons. And so that goes up into A tier. Next, we have Elegy of the Souls. This is quite an interesting finale to the trials overall, and I honestly love it for the most part. There are certain parts that gets frustrating, but I'll get to that in a moment. This fight is very well telegraphed. It is very easy to understand what's roughly going to happen, give or take. He's going to cycle through the same set of archetypes: the Seeker, the Warrior, the Knight, the Thief, then the Masked Dancer, Summoner, Berserker, then Prince. He's always going to go on that same cycle every single time. You can also guarantee that when it cycles into a new archetype, it's going to do the various different buffs that archetype can do. And then also you can guarantee that 2 times per round of this cycle, it's going to give itself some form of immunity to physical-based attacks. The first time will be as the Assassin or the Thief. I don't remember off the top of my head which one it chooses out of the 2, but it gives itself immunity to any form of physical attacks. But this isn't Matakan, so you actually have to sacrifice one of your moves in a turn to get rid of that immunity, which isn't too difficult. You just wait until one of your last moves and then just whack him with one of your melee hits. It just blocks it and then moves on. And then later on in the Summoner, it will give itself Makatan, which is a lot easier to deal with because you can just use the Matter Break to get rid of its ability to block / repel the physical based attacks, and so that's not too much of a problem. And then because of how telegraphed a lot of its entire thing is going to be, it's not too hard to predict roughly what's going to happen, and so it's not too difficult of a fight. I would say that difficulty wise, I would put it below Devourer of the Stars, because for me, purely because Devourer of the Stars was just so unpredictable with what it does, and you can get really unlucky and it completely screws you. Though one thing to note here is that what the Elegy of Souls does for the most part is then very heavily RNG dependent, because both the Knight and the Persona Dancer, or the Persona Master and Master Dancers will give some form of weaknesses to your party as a whole, which then the Elegy of Souls may or may not capitalize throughout the Summoner / the Prince. You'll either get really lucky and it doesn't do any form of major weakness buffing that is hard to deal with, and then it doesn't even do an attack to take advantage of said weakness it gives you, or you can get really unlucky where it gives your entire party weakness to fire, and then the very next thing it does in the Summoner is does the Dragon God damage and just does a ton of damage if you're not prepared for it. And that's just one of the things here. If you get any form of mass weakness, I would just immediately guard. Don't take the chance that RNG is going to favor you and not do that attack that screws you, because it most likely will. RNG's a bitch in this game. Also, once you get Elegy of the Souls down to roughly around a quarter of its health, it will now start hero crying in every one of its turns. And honestly, my biggest advice to you here, this is where you need to wipe him flipping quickly, because with that hero cry, it can now very quickly get out of hand the amount of damage that it's able to output. And if it goes on for long enough, when it rotates into the Prince archetype, he'll just wipe your party. That's it. It'll just wipe your party. You can't stop it. It's going to wipe your party after a certain amount of time. It doesn't like that. Ultimately, it's a very interesting fight. I believe I did drop the difficulty after several attempts down to easy, purely because it was getting late in the night for me for the stream that I was doing this. I didn't want to stretch it into another stream, and I just wanted to end it. Because RNG was just being a bitch. I got it so close so many times, but then got screwed because, you know, you had your whole team together, full health, full everything, and then suddenly RNG gives him, he gets a hero cry, and RNG gives you the unluck, and you just get smashed in that entire turn, and that's about it. Which kind of sucks, but that's just how this game goes if you're not over leveled. So taking the Elegy of the Souls, I will put him into A tier at the top. And next we have Archdemon Louis. Man, what a fight. This one, honestly, this one gets very much overshadowed by what happens afterwards, and so not too much of it stays at the top of my mind. Even though I did this like 2 days ago, I don't really, like, as I said, the one that happens after Archdemon Louis just completely overshadows Archdemon Louis as a whole. It's not a bad fight. It will definitely require you to use a lot of your resources to break through him entirely, but it's neither here nor there. A really awesome design of a boss, by the way. Like, for everyone, it's like, oh my god, Louis is hot. Well, there's your fan service right there for you. Like, what a design. Like, holy crap. And so I'm just going to grab him and I'm going to throw him into below A tier. As I said, it's not forgettable per se, it just gets very much overshadowed by what happens next, which is Destroyer Charadrius. I have one major gripe with this fight. Just one very big one. So for the entirety of this game, for any bosses that go into multi-stages, whether it be one of the first ones you come across, which is Zorba into Homo Avus, it will give you all your health and all your MP back in between the two things. It doesn't give you a chance to change any of your archetypes or stuff along those lines. You're kind of stuck with what you've currently got. And the same goes with the Dragon God into Homo Margo. But with Destroyer Charadrius, it's got a second phase, and unlike how it's presented itself in the rest of the game, where you go into a second stage of a second round of boss fights right after the first one, it does not heal you at all. You're stuck with whatever resources that you previously burned on the first phase of the fight. And trust me when I say this, you will burn a lot of resources. Like, you cannot, like, personally, you can't one attempt this fight. It's very unlikely, unless, again, you're over level to Shindang, you're going to get screwed by the second phase that suddenly doesn't actually heal you anymore. Which is, look, that's probably the thing that annoys me the most out of this. The fact that for the entirety of the game, it does that, where you go into a second round like Zorba into Homo Avus or the Dragon God into Homo Margo, it heals your entirety of your MP pools and your health, but it doesn't let you change your archetypes. It does let you change who's equipped before the Homo Margo fight, but with Destroy Charadrius, when you move into phase 2, nope, you're stuck with what you currently got. Heck, you're reset back to the team you had at the start of the previous Destroy Charadrius fight. So let's say you swapped the teammates over time to better fit what was going on. No, the game's reset you back to what you had before you went into the Destroy Charadrius fight. Ignoring that massive gripe I personally have with the fight, just that one little thing that it gives you a second phase, but then goes against what it's telegraphed to you the entire game, where it does restore your MP and health into the next phase of whatever boss fight you're doing. Heck, it did that before. When you went from Archdemon into Destroy Charadrius, it gives you back all your MP. Then you fight more, use a bunch of it, use some more of your health, and then you get all that MP back again. It just feels weird that it doesn't do that here, which just makes this fight so much more difficult than what it should be, in my opinion. Granted, it's also the final one of the game, so they probably wanted to make sure that you eat shit a few times. I do love the whole idea of the first phase. He's got 3 different masks on. He will consume a puppet of one of the various races to do massive amounts of either damage, whether it be physical or magical, or heal itself for about 700 per mask, or if you do enough damage to the mask that's currently going to consume a puppet, it will drop it, and it will lose a move on its turn, which is really useful. I also like the second phase, where he has this thing where he exerts high pressure, which then effectively halves the amount of moves you have for that turn. He also has the whole naming a race that is despicable, or whatever the heck he wants to choose to call it, so that the next time round, if you still have a unit of that race in your main party, he will just one-shot it. It's a really cool thing, and I think it's a really, really awesome payoff to the fact that your entire team is consistent of one of every single tribe, except for the Rog. I don't think that you get any Rogs at all, which is weird, but we don't talk about that. I just like the idea of that. Granted, I couldn't really appreciate it at the time when I did it the other night, because I was just so pissed off at the whole it doesn't restore your MP in between phases like it's done for literally everything else in this game. Like, that really got on my nerves, that entire thing. The game's telegraphed a certain thing that it was doing and then just didn't do it here, but I still really love this boss fight. It's a really great finale to Metaphor. And I think it's very, like, outside of that one little issue I have with it that really pissed me off at the time, I think overall it's really good. I love the fact that it is a very heavy all or nothing fight twice. Like, it's all or nothing, but you also kind of have to reserve some of your resources and items for the second phase, otherwise the second phase will just screw you. So ultimately, in spite of my frustrations of it, I'm going to put Destroy Charadrius into the S tier. And so that's it. That's my choices for all of the main bosses in Metaphor ReFantazio. What are your thoughts? Do you agree with my list or do you not? Let me know what your list is in the comments down below. Whom do you think is the best boss out of this? Who do you think has the coolest design? But until next time, bye bye!